So you've heard in the news that there are currently protesters that are blocking rail lines between Ontario and Quebec. This has been a big topic in the news because the rail line is used by everyday people traveling by train, and it's been a huge disruption to the public. Who are these protesters? They're a mix of local Indigenous people and environmental activists, and they've set up camp on train tracks near Ottawa and are protesting in solidarity with a different Indigenous group in British Columbia called the Wet'suwet'en Nation. What are they in solidarity of? Some members of the Wet'suwet'en Nation are currently occupying the proposed construction site of a company called Coastal GasLink, who is starting to build a pipeline through their territory. And these people have all the usual concerns about a pipeline, namely environmental damage. So the protest has nothing to do with the railways or the area near Ottawa. These people are protesting on behalf of the people in British Columbia who are occupying a pipeline construction site where nobody can see them. This is the point of the rail protest. It's to bring visibility to the Wet'suwet'ens up in BC, and it's working. So, two popular narratives have emerged from this disruptive situation. On the right, you hear, these protests are illegal and are disturbing the economy and travelers. If the government doesn't put a stop to this illegal protest, it will encourage this behavior in the future and set a precedent for everyone who doesn't like a decision that was rightfully made and hold Canadians hostage. On the left, you hear, Canadians need to have patience and stand in solidarity with these protesters. Don't you know what they've been through? This is Indigenous land which the settlers stole, and if they don't want to build a pipeline through it, we shouldn't make them. The answer is simple. Don't build a pipeline through their land, and the protests will stop. So, who's right? Well, it's complicated, so I'll try to add some nuance to these opposing views. From a governance perspective, it seems like the answer should be simple. If the Wet'suwet'en Nation gave their sign-off to have this pipeline built, it should be built. But it's a bit more complicated than this. So did they give their sign-off? Well, it's true that the required 20 elected band council leaders signed off on the project. These band council leaders are the group of people who the Canadian government recognizes as the representatives of their nation. But just like in any government, there are internal disagreements within the Wet'suwet'en Nation. The 20 band council members are given legitimacy to make the decisions for their people through the Indian Act, which is a Canadian law. There are members of the Wet'suwet'en Nation who do not recognize the legitimacy of the Indian Act, and for good reason. Unlike most of Canada's land, Canada never formally acquired most of the land in BC. In other words, the Wet'suwet'ens never transferred it, ceded it, or lost it in a war or conquest. All of this to say that some Wet'suwet'ens argue that these 20 elected band council leaders do not speak for them. Instead, they say according to their traditional law, there are 13 hereditary chiefs who actually represent them. The hereditary chiefs draw their authority from Wet'suwet'en law, which predates colonization. So you have the hereditary chiefs on the side of the protesters versus the Canada-recognized band council leaders on the other. You can see how this gets complicated for law enforcement. Coastal GasLink calls up the RCMP and says, hey, can you get these people off of our construction site? They show up and some of the Wet'suwet'ens say, we've gone through the process and we understand the environmental risks, but we have decided that the jobs and economic boost a pipeline will give to our people is worth it. Get these protesters who do not represent our elected views out of the way of our sweet pipeline money. Then other Wet'suwet'ens say, these people who you have elected do not have any power here. We draw our power from laws that predate your elections. So the RCMP basically has to look at the commissioner to tell them what to do, and I imagine she's just as confused as anyone. So far, it looks like the RCMP is backing off for the time being. So there are disagreements within the Wet'suwet'en Nation itself. The side with the authority of Canada says Coastal GasLink should go ahead with the pipeline. The side with the authority of ancient Wet'suwet'en law says Canada should block the pipeline. But there are other matters complicating this story. I mentioned before that there are 13 hereditary chiefs. Well, it's been reported that most of the traditional hereditary chiefs, the ones the protests are supposed to be supporting, actually support the pipeline. This seems to bring more legitimacy to the view that the protesters do not reflect the will of most Wet'suwet'ens. So back to the rail line near Ottawa. Why do these protesters then seem to have so much support? Most of the protesters who are blocking the railways are Indigenous people who live near this major rail line. But there are also now a lot of environmental activists who have joined the protests as a sort of anti-pipeline ally. Some argue that these environmentalists are putting their anti-pipeline environmental agenda over the desires of the majority of the Wet'suwet'en people. This insurgence of environmental allies may be making the protests seem like they have more strength in the Wet'suwet'en Nation than they actually do. So what's our poor Prime Minister to do? This is a doozy. He has two main options, and neither of them are great. His first option would be to submit to the protesters' demand and block the construction of the pipeline going through Wet'suwet'en territory. The pros of this option are you get the protesters off the train tracks without force, you make a bunch of environmentalists really happy, and you give an unknown proportion of the Wet'suwet'en people what they've asked for. The cons are that it seems like a larger proportion of the Wet'suwet'ens actually want the pipeline and the benefits that it will bring to their people, and by submitting to the protesters, you allow an unelected minority to speak for everyone else. The Wet'suwet'ens potentially lose out on an economic boon for their people. Trudeau's second option is to break up the protests and use the police to forcibly remove the protesters off of the train tracks, after which point he can dialogue with the Wet'suwet'en people. The pros of this decision would be that the railways free up the movement of goods and people. CN Railways has already reported that it's laid off over 400 people because of the strikes. Now, whether this was actually necessary and actually because of the strikes is another story. The cons, though, are massive. The government sending in police force to forcibly remove these people is optics that the Prime Minister, who has worked hard to market himself as an Indigenous and environmental advocate, are optics he does not want. Even if, in theory, he didn't care about the protesters, a government directing police forces is not something that's done lightly. There was a good news article about this in Global News questioning whether or not it's even legal. The answer is maybe yes, but it's complicated and it looks really bad. If I try to boil all this information down in a way that my brain can handle, it seems like what all of this turmoil comes down to is the fact that the governance structure of the Wet'suwet'en people and probably other Aboriginal groups is not clear. Who speaks for the Wet'suwet'en people, the hereditary chiefs or the Band Council? To be clear, I don't believe this confusion with who has the last word on issues like this is the fault of the Wet'suwet'ens. I imagine the Wet'suwet'ens had their government pretty well figured out before Europeans came and messed everything up for them. The one thing I think is clear is that I think we'll begin to see other Indigenous groups making decisions about which governance system takes rank so that situations like this don't happen to them. Thank you so much for watching this video. My name is Gabby, and I'm just an ordinary Canadian citizen trying to learn about my government. If there's something I didn't get right in this video, leave it in the comments. I'm hoping to start making more videos like this about complicated and not so complicated topics about the Canadian government. So if you like this video, leave me some encouragement in the comments and like and subscribe. See you next time.